Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, sponsored by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. In recent years, a number of evangelicals have been claiming that the present-day Temple Mount in Jerusalem is actually not where Solomon and Herod's temples originally stood. This episode is part 3 of a special 3-part virtual roundtable discussion evaluating these claims. Now, joining me here today in the studio is Director of ABR and co-host of Digging for Truth, Scott Lancer. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing well, Henry.
All right, it's good to have you back in the saddle for episode number 3 on this. And we're going to bring in here Dr. Scott Stripling, archaeologist and our friend from Katy, Texas at the Bible Seminary.
Hi, Henry. Great to be with you today.
All right, Scott, it's great to see you. Well, you get to really be the man in this episode because we're going to be hitting archaeology squared, if you want to say it that way, as it relates to the Temple Mount. We've touched upon it in the previous episodes, and we want to invite our audience to please go back and watch those 2 episodes and follow along with what we're trying to make an argument for. But we left off talking about the Antonia Fortress, how the whole idea that the Temple Mount, that the Antonia Fortress was the Temple Mount, that doesn't work. But there's other archaeology that's related to this, something called Opus Sectili Pavers. I love saying that, by the way, Opus Sectili. Tell folks, what is that and why is that related to this debate?
Well, in the late 1990s, there was some destruction done to the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, and you had over 40 tons of archaeological material that was ripped out of context and dumped into the Kidron Valley. It was then relocated over to the Sudim Valley on the Mount of Olives. The Temple Mount Salvage Project was launched by Gabi Barkai. And in the sifting of that, and ABR took teams there, and I worked as a supervisor on that project. And this is where we became very big believers in wet sifting. But they began to recover what were called opus sectili, or cut decorative polychrome stones that were unique and diagnostic of the 1st century or late Second Temple period. Now, a lady who was working on the project, and she had just started when I became acquainted with her, is Frankie Snyder. And she was a math teacher who had retired and was now working in Israel, and her geometry skills helped crack this code. So to then take these different geometric shapes and make them fit together, for the first time we could see what the paving looked like that Josephus had talked about and that other inscriptions had talked about. They were known from other Herodian sites, Jericho, Kypros, Masada, and so forth. And now we were actually getting them off the Temple Mount. And by the way, that's another reason why the Temple Mount, historical Temple Mount, could not be the Antonia Fortress, because it's got opus sectili paving on it. It makes no sense at all.
So this was done by the Muslims who are in control of the Temple Mount, and so in their own sort of accident of history, by illegally pulling this material out, they actually end up producing evidence of the antiquity of the temple of the Jewish people on the site. It's kind of remarkable.
Right, and so Josephus in 5:192-93 talks about these special types of stone. And then also an inscription found inside a mikveh just immediately south of the Temple Mount also talks about a donation for these special stones that were paving the temple. Paving the temple, not paving the Antonia Fortress.
Yes.
Yeah. And Scott, Josephus also talks about Gentile prohibition and on inscriptions. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so the Soreg, S-O-R-E-G, Soreg, separated the court of the Gentiles. And according to Josephus, the inscription said, any Gentile crossing this point will be responsible for his own death. 2 of these have been found, recovered archaeologically. Some were written in Latin and some in Greek to make sure that everybody could understand it. The Greek ones are the ones that have been found so far, and both of them were found north of the Temple Mount, not south, where these revisionists would claim that the temple stood. How could they possibly have gotten all the way north of the historical Temple Mount if the temple was way down in the city of David? Archaeological material does not migrate uphill, and it's a very steep uphill. It always migrates downhill.
Yeah, when I saw you write about that, I just thought about the Gentile prohibitions generically. but I hadn't thought about the location because I hadn't read about that before. And what you're mentioning is we always have the principle of erosion that takes place over time is fundamentally part of what you're getting at. So remains always migrate to the south. Well, that's where the city of David is. Right. So in their theory, we should have these kinds of remains have made its way down to the city of David. Do we have anything like that in the city of David?
No, and in fact, the city of David has been extensively excavated. I mean, I'm here in my office, and next to me is Bliss and Dickey and Kenyon and volumes from all the digs that have happened over the last more than a century, and no Opus Sectili have been recovered or published from the city of David. So if the temple was there, we would expect to find those types of things.
Cool. Now, we were going to talk about this next segment, but we have some time here to introduce it. So let's do that, Scott. There's been other inscriptions found in the traditional area of the Temple Mount in the southwest corner near Robinson's Arch. Let's talk about that a little bit. You could give the audience a flavor of some of that, and then we'll pick up on it in the next segment.
Sure. The most famous one is the Trumpeting Inscription. So at the southwest corner, which is, by the way, where Josephus says the trumpeter stood on the Temple Mount to signal the beginning and end of Shabbat. What do you find? Had fallen 130 feet down, right at the southwest corner, you find an inscription that says, "To the place of the trumpeting." And the inscription is small, but it's very clear. And there's fragments of plaster left in it. So apparently it was an instruction to the stonemasons to know where to place that particular stone. It had to be in the southwest corner, in other words, and then they plastered over the stone. So it wasn't meant for passersby to read. It was an instruction for those who were assembling those stones. That's massive. It's on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount, our historical Temple Mount. How could that possibly be the Antonia Fortress, as the revisionists claim? Because once again, archaeological material does not migrate steeply uphill. And it's covered by other massive ashlars too. It makes no sense at all.
Yeah, and just to clarify for our audience what we're talking about here, you said 138 feet, is that the distance?
Yes.
Right, that's been measured. So when the Romans destroyed the temple and all its associated buildings, they threw the stuff off of the Temple Mount and it came down and it smashed the street. Now, we're going to talk about that in the next episode. We're going to have pictures of that. Anybody who goes there and sees that, it's actually a very sobering experience to see that, because this is the judgment of God. But it's in the right place. It's not down in the city of David where this is. It's up at the Temple Mount, like we've been talking about. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth today. We're glad you're here. We're glad that you're here for part 3 of a 3-part episode on the Temple Mount with Dr. Scott Stripling and Scott Lancer, and we're glad to have you here. We hope you come back for our next segment. Don't go away.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Scott Lancer, Director of ABR, Scott Stripling, Archaeologist, Director of the Shiloh Excavations, joining us from Katy, Texas. Scott, we were talking about the destruction of the temple, the place of trumpeting, the inscription, thrown off of the Temple Mount 138 feet down. But underneath that rubble of both the inscription and the stones from the temple complex are some other discoveries found. Tell the audience about that. They're fascinating.
They sure are. In the renewed that was originally excavated by Mazar, Benjamin Mazar. In the renewed excavations at Robinson's Arch by Reich and Shukron, they wisely decided to lift the paving. And as for archaeologists, when we find a sealed locus, that's very important because we know it's not been contaminated. So they lifted that massive paving that had been smashed, and in the drainage channel and in the area next to it, actually right underneath some of the foundation stones, 3 important objects were found, and they are very Jewish in nature. One of them is a golden bell in the shape of a pomegranate. Now, we know that bells and pomegranates adorned the hem of the high priest, and that is very well what you have here is literally a bell from the high priest's garments as described in the Bible, and it is there not next to the Antonia fortress. I mean, that would make no sense why you would have a bell from the high priest's garment there. Right next to it, you also have a ritual purity token. Now, we mentioned in the last episode that there was a wave of ritual purity that swept through late Second Temple period Judaism. Here's some proof of it. So it has in Aramaic, it looks like a dice. It's made out of stone, and it says, pure unto Yah. So this is, of course, we know about these from Josephus and from other rabbinic literature. Either it could be used to impress on something that it was ritually pure and could enter the temple precincts, or it could be a token given to someone to prove that he had undergone ritual purification and now was eligible to enter the temple precincts. It doesn't get any more Jewish than that. And then thirdly, we have an etching of a menorah. And the menorah, the candelabra of the Jews, we know from the Arch of Titus and the Magdala Synagogue stone and other places, that's the most Jewish of all things. So you've got a pomegranate-shaped golden bell, you've got a ritual purity token, and then you've got an etching of a menorah, all right there together at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. That, along with the trumpeting inscription, it makes no sense to argue that this is the Antonia fortress. The Antonia fortress would not have 36 mikvahot surrounding it. It would not have these objects and these inscriptions.
Makes a lot of sense to me. What do you think, Scott?
Well, Henry, I think this is a good time to talk some trash, and we're going to do that. We're going to do that. Now, Scott, the revisionists claim that the temple was over the city of David near the Gihon Spring, and I think we need to talk about whether that is even physically possible that could have been there.
Scott, it is not physically possible. And proposal one, the original Martin proposal, was that it was over the Gihon Spring. Now, that would be more consistent with their arguments from Aristeas and so forth that you have to have a spring. But the second proposal that Kornuk advocates doesn't even have it over the Gihon Spring. Well, the problem with placing a temple over the Gihon Spring in the Second Temple period is that there was a garbage dump 70 meters deep that had accumulated there over a couple of hundred years. How could you possibly get 70 meters of garbage underneath the temple if the temple was standing there? So it is an impossibility. So just this one fact alone should cause a fair-minded person to reconsider his or her position. And all this idea that how glorious the temple was that Aristeas is describing, you have to remember Aristeas is writing prior to the building of Herod's temple. He's writing when you have that rundown temple that they were all crying about and whining about how terrible the temple looked. Well, that's not at all according with what we have in the Bible.
So this we call it the trash. Just describe, maybe for the audience, we're going to put pictures up of this just to show how much material is there from the time that the temple was supposed to be there, according to the revisionist theory. Maybe you can expand on that, Scott, because this is such an important argument in my mind as far as just the pure archaeology of it.
Well, we'll put a picture up for folks to be able to see just how deep this is. But the area around the Gihon Spring has, just picture a football field, the depth of a football field in solid garbage. Just think of a modern garbage dump, how high that would be. That's what you have around the Gihon Spring, the entire eastern slope of the city of David. It's not possible for the temple to be there when they're accumulating garbage, and the pottery and the other objects, coins and flints and all the beads and jewelry and all the things that you would normally find. It's unmistakable what the date of it would be.
Yeah, so now we're talking, just to visualize for folks, again, down in the city of David and around the Gihon Spring, material from the time of Jesus being dumped there, meters thick, when the revisionists say that that's where the temple was. So this is literally impossible to be the case archaeologically. The other thing,
speaking of impossible, Henry,
go ahead.
As an archaeologist, we excavated a city that was destroyed by the Romans in AD 69. Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. All right, our city was demolished just like Jerusalem, so it's a microcosm. But guess what? All the material is still there. All the broken stones and lintels and everything that was destroyed is still there. There's nothing in the city of David. And since the revisionists are not archaeologists, they don't claim to be, and no archaeologist agrees with them, they simply say, well, not one stone's left upon another, so it was going to be totally unrecognizable, and therefore everything's gone. Anyone who's ever been on an archaeological dig knows that's impossible.
Yeah, that's a very good summary of that. So, folks, we just want to emphasize once again, as we finish up this, we're going into our final segment here in a few moments. Our intention here, Dr. Stripling and Director Lancer and myself, is to not attack people personally. We're not doing that. That's not our intention. We hope you've picked that up from us, is to evaluate arguments, both biblically and archaeologically. And we hope that you've been able to see so far the unviability of this theory. So, gentlemen, we're going to go to a break. We're going to come back for segment 3, and we're going to wrap up this special 3-part episode of Digging for Truth. And with that, we'll be right back.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith, and I'm here with Scott Lancer and Scott Stripling. We're talking about the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, we had talked previously about Luke 19, Scott, and I thought I would let Scott Lancer read a little bit from here, where Jesus laments over the destruction of Jerusalem. And maybe you could start with verse 44, Scott, and just read 44 through, and then we're going to discuss this text and its relation to archaeology. Scott, you mentioned it in our first episode, but we want to talk about this some more. So if you would, Scott, please.
From verse 44, and we're just jumping into the context here, and
Correct.
it says, "And tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation."
Now here, Scott, what Scott Lancer is referring to is Jesus' lament over Jerusalem, as I mentioned. Now, if you hyper-literalize this text, what conclusion do you have to draw, and then how does that fit the archaeology?
Well, you would have to say that literally then not one stone of any structure from the first century was left upon another. And even if that were the case, they would all still be there. The stones would be there. You'd be able to put them back together. But
Yes.
we know from excavating Khirbet el-Maqater, which was demolished by the 10th Roman Legion, just like Jerusalem. So we have a unique perspective. We've excavated a site destroyed by the 10th Legion, and now we're at Shiloh where the tabernacle stood. So I think we've got some insight into this. The destruction only goes down to a certain point. To get to the foundations, then you would have to move all the stones that you've just destroyed from the upper superstructure and remove those so you could get down to the foundations. That wasn't the point. I mean, Jesus is communicating to them that their city's going to be demolished. They understood that, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and so you pointed out some buildings that we know for sure. By the way, if the Temple Mount is the Antonia Fortress, then it's still standing. So if the Antonia Fortress foundation is still standing, why wasn't that torn down to the ground? Isn't that a logical question to ask?
It's not a consistent position that they're taking.
Okay. So tell us about like Herod's 3 towers and the mansions and the Jewish quarter and that kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, folks who have been inside Jaffa Gate recognize what's called the Tower of David today, but the foundations of that are Second Temple period. They're not Davidic. And so we have the three towers, Phasael, Hippicus, and Mariamne, that are written about, that are so glorious. And you can see that foundations of that massive tower there. And then all throughout Jerusalem, just go and look at the burnt house that's, the remnants of that are standing. And look at the sections of wall that are still standing. The outside, the Mount Zion dig, just outside Zion Gate today, they're uncovering all these priestly mansions that are there from the Second Temple period. They were burned, they were destroyed, but the remains are still there, and you've got many stones that are still standing. So it is impossible to argue that not one stone of Jerusalem was left standing. Jesus was speaking in hyperbole or in a type of metaphorical language that they clearly understood, that they were going to get demolished. It didn't have to mean that literally you couldn't have two stones that were still segued.
Right, and in the case where he was actually being more literal, we're talking about the temple and the temple buildings, and that's exactly what happened. Because that represented Jerusalem. That was the judgment of God too. The specific was upon the temple, although it was the city in general as well. Well, gentlemen, we've had a tour de force here, and there's even more that we could talk about. But what I'd like to do is, as we wrap up here, is sort of get both of your perspectives of why this is important. I'm going to start with Scott Lancer first. Scott, you're the director of ABR, right? And so it's your responsibility to sort of shepherd over what we're doing here, and you and I work closely together to develop these episodes. You're also a pastor. So, what would you say as someone who's saying, well, we're attacking people or we're being divisive over this, or why are we fighting over this? Could you maybe comment on that a little bit from your perspective?
Yeah, well, when you're talking about fascinating subjects like the temple and the location of the temple, this captures a lot of people's attention. They're very interested in this whole subject. And if you're introducing information that is false or misleading, you are affecting people's understanding of the Word of God. And that's how we have to look at this. This is a serious thing. This isn't a personal issue, although there are times where I think all of us feel there's a little bit of an offense here on some of these things, because it's like, look, we're not out there on a treasure hunt. We're not out there doing things to write books or to make yourself well known. This is more serious than that.
Yeah. It's a search for truth. That's
right. From a pastoral perspective, what we're trying to do. I mean, in an earlier episode, I used the word ridiculous. Well, sometimes that is exactly how we feel about some of these things. Some of these claims have absolutely no basis whatsoever. And that's why we feel strongly about that. But we want to conduct ourselves with dignity, and we don't want to be personal. And anyway, that's my 2 cents on this.
That's excellent. It's more than 2 cents, Scott. It's much more than that. Very valuable. Now, Scott Stripling, about a minute and a half. Now, I know you have the same perspective as Scott. You were a former pastor at one time, and you do shepherd people, but you're also an archaeologist. And maybe give us your summary from that perspective, please.
I would love it if our revisionist friends would reach out to us. There are evangelicals largely that are advocating this. We are fellow evangelicals, and we are trained archaeologists. Reach out to us for information. We'll be happy to share the expertise that we have with you. To take someone out of his or her area of expertise and then to cite him or her as an expert, you get into a lot of factual errors. And so this has caught on, and it has a lot of popularity. We think that it's inaccurate, and today we wanted to set the record straight. And if any of our friends that hold this view right now would like to dialogue about it, we'd encourage them to reach out to us.
Well, gentlemen, it has been, as I mentioned before, a tour de force here, 3 episodes, but it was really important that we do it. First, Dr. Stripling, Scott, my friend, thank you for your great contributions on this subject. We're looking forward to your academic article and further work to sort of put out there our perspective on this. Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
And Scott Lancer, of course, my good friend here in the studio. and colleague, thank you for stewarding us along in this subject.
Thank you.
Appreciate you, man.
Yes.
Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this three-part series. We hope that you understand our perspective. We've emphasized numerous times that we want to treat people with respect, but we also want to tell the truth about what the Bible says, about what the archaeology indicates, what the historians indicate, and so on. So we hope you appreciate what we've done here on Digging for Truth. The temple was located where the mount is today, and you can have confidence in that. And we thank you for supporting the ministry of ABR and for watching Digging for Truth. We hope to see you again soon.